In the winter of 1942, as the Second World War entered its third year, the North Sea became one of the most hostile and strategically contested regions in Europe. Few outside the Royal Air Force understood just how dangerous those skies were. Crews of RAF Bomber Command knew the odds well. Every operation across the North Sea meant facing powerful storms, unpredictable navigation, and the constant threat of German radar, flak, and night fighters. Still, the missions continued, not because survival was expected, but because the stakes were too high to stop. By January of that year, the German U-boat campaign was crippling Allied supply convoys bringing fuel, materials, and food from North America. Ports such as Wilhelmshaven, Hamburg, and Bremen were central hubs for submarine construction and naval deployment. Every night, RAF squadrons were tasked with disrupting these operations, knowing each bomb dropped might mean one less U-boat stalking the Atlantic shipping lanes. Stationed at RAF Lossiemouth and RAF Leuchars in northern Scotland were several squadrons equipped with Vickers Wellington and Handley Page Hampton bombers. These aircraft, rugged yet vulnerable, had become the workhorses of the night bombing campaign. On the evening of February 16, 1942, 5 such aircraft were assigned to a coordinated mission over the North Sea, a flight expected to test the limits of both man and machine. Flight Sergeant Thomas Murray of the 57 Squadron wrote in his diary that afternoon, "Another night operation. Weather's turning rough again. They say timing is everything, but out here, luck seems more important." The entry ended abruptly with a single sentence. "If we make it back, this one will be worth remembering." Ground crews worked methodically as twilight faded. Engines were checked, bomb racks secured, oxygen systems tested, radios calibrated. The men loading the aircraft knew most of the faces boarding them. Some had known each other for years, others only weeks, but all shared the silent routine of war. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic farewells. Just nods, handshakes, and the habitual pat on the fuselage, as though the aircraft could feel encouragement. At 1943 hours, the first bomber lifted into the air, followed by the remaining 4 within the next 11 minutes. The radio operator logged the final departure time simply as 5 airborne. Mission underway. As the aircraft moved farther from the coast, the situation changed rapidly. Winds over the North Sea intensified, creating turbulence strong enough to rattle instruments. Thick cloud banks obscured the moonlight, eliminating visual navigation cues. Radar, still in its early wartime evolution, offered only partial assistance. The crews relied heavily on dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and experience, tools that became nearly useless under storm conditions. Still, radio transmissions during the first hour of flight remained routine. One pilot reported minor icing forming along the leading edge of the wings. Another requested a frequency check after brief static interference. Such reports were common enough that no immediate alarm was raised. Then, shortly after 2100 hours, weather stations along the Scottish coast recorded a sudden shift. Wind speed increased to near gale force and pressure readings dropped sharply. Farther out over the water, conditions deteriorated even faster. The aircraft pressed deeper into darkness despite warnings issued earlier that day by meteorological officers, warnings which command had noted but ultimately overruled due to operational necessity. Inside the cramped, cold fuselage of each bomber, the men worked mostly in silence. The engines roared so loudly that even shouting often went unheard. Frost began creeping across the inside of the cockpit glass. Oxygen masks froze to the touch. Yet the mission continued. One final message was received at 21:26 hours from the crew of aircraft KX-913 belonging to RAF 50 Squadron. The transmission was faint, distorted by interference, but clear enough to be logged. Course correction received, continuing to target, weather worsening. It was the last recorded communication from any of the 5 bombers. Minutes later, radar operators tracking the formations watched in growing confusion. One contact blinked and disappeared. Then another. Within the following half hour, all 5 radar signatures were gone, erased as though they had never existed. At RAF Lossiemouth, ground crews remained unaware of the unfolding mystery. They watched the runway lights glow against the wind-driven mist, waiting for the first returning aircraft. But as the night passed, hope turned to concern and then to dread. By dawn, the realization settled heavily across the base. Not a single bomber had returned. No distress calls. No sightings. No survivors. Only silence, vast, cold, and absolute. And that silence raised the first unsettling question of the investigation. How could 5 operational RAF bombers vanish into the night, without leaving a single trace? The night the bombers disappeared, the weather charts issued from RAF Coastal Command already indicated deteriorating atmospheric conditions. Yet to the crews waiting in briefing rooms, the mission remained unchanged. Intelligence officers emphasized the strategic importance of the target area, German naval traffic suspected near Trondheim, and increased U-boat refueling activity in the Norwegian Sea. The need was immediate. The risk, unspoken but understood, was equally severe. The aircraft assigned for this mission, Wellington Mark ICs and Hanley Page Hamptons, were capable machines but had limitations. Both models were known for relatively narrow wingspans and light airframes, designs better suited to endurance than stability in violent weather. The Wellingtons, nicknamed Wimpies, relied heavily on their geodetic framework, strong yet vulnerable to icing and turbulence. The Hamptons, with their slim cockpit profiles, gave pilots poor lateral visibility, especially on night flights. Flight Lieutenant Harold Whitman of 50 Squadron remarked earlier that week, "We fly blind. Always have. The sea doesn't give second chances." His words would later resurface in official reports, underlined by investigators searching for meaning in absence. Shortly after 2200 hours, atmospheric interference increased across all regional frequencies. Operators monitoring encrypted RAF signals noted brief static surges that washed across the channel like thunder. Morse keys tapped intermittently, then fell silent. These communications, routine at first, became strained, unintelligible, and finally non-existent. At 2217, the last readable broadcast came from the Hampton operated by Flying Officer Leonard Reeves. His message was concise, almost clinical. Altitude fluctuating. Adjusting trim. Maintaining course. There was no mention of mechanical failure, enemy aircraft, or emergency conditions. Then the transmission cut abruptly, replaced by a sharp spike of static. Reeves' call sign never returned. Meanwhile, radar tracking stations along the eastern Scottish coast attempted to reacquire signals. Radar sets of that era, chain home low and the newer centimetric technology, offered only partial coverage. Their range over water was limited, and weather degraded readings further. Still, operators documented something unusual. Instead of drifting gradually before fading, the signatures belonging to each bomber extinguished suddenly. One vanished, then another. Within 33 minutes, all 5 aircraft had disappeared from operational screens. Inside air traffic receiving, confusion gave way to procedure. The first priority was establishing communication. The second was determining whether the bombers had altered course or diverted to emergency landing strips across remote Scotland or the Orkney Islands. Messages were sent. None were answered. By midnight, staff were alerted at RAF WWII and RAF Tain to scan for possible forced landings. Coastal artillery outposts stretching from Aberdeen to Peterhead were ordered to report any sounds of engines or visible flares. No sightings were logged. For the families of the aircrew, the world remained unchanged. Letters were already written, waiting to be mailed. Photographs sat above fireplaces. Radios played quietly in living rooms, unaware that their familiar static-filled broadcasts would soon be replaced with telegrams no family wanted to receive. Hours passed. The runway crews waited with binoculars, ears straining for any distant drone of engines. But the night offered only wind, an endless hollow sound rolling in from the North Sea. At 2:51 hours, an entry was recorded in the RAF station log. Mission aircraft overdue. All crews listed as missing. The sentence was administrative in nature, yet its weight was unmistakable. These words marked the transition from expectation to uncertainty. Some officers speculated icing or navigational drift into enemy airspace. Others proposed interception by Luftwaffe night fighters flown from bases in Denmark or Stavanger. Yet even these explanations felt incomplete. There had been no German radio traffic detected, no emergency beacons triggered, no partial calls attempting to signal distress. It was as if the night had swallowed them, swiftly, silently, without warning. Dawn approached slowly, stained gray by winter clouds. The first rescue aircraft prepared for departure, its engines warming under frost. Standing beside the runway, a mechanic muttered quietly, "5 bombers don't just vanish. Something happened out there." His comment, overheard by an officer nearby, was noted but not acknowledged. Because in the hours after the disappearance, the greatest fear wasn't simply that the crews were gone. It was that no one knew why. And the deeper the investigation began to reach, the more unsettling the unanswered questions became. By the early hours of the morning on February 17, 1942, RAF radar stations along the East Coast were fully aware that the situation had escalated from routine disruption to something unprecedented. Operators at stations in Inverbervie, Dice, and Netherbutton had confirmed the same conclusion. 5 separate radar contacts had vanished, not drifted, not weakened, vanished almost simultaneously. For experienced technicians who had monitored hundreds of operational flights, this pattern was chillingly abnormal. At 2:07, Radar Tracking Officer Corporal Edwin Marks wrote in his notebook, "Signal loss abrupt. No echoes. No fading." Years later, when interviewed, he clarified, "Aircraft don't simply disappear. Even when they go down, sea or land, you see scatter. You see ghosting. You see something. But that night we saw nothing." The sudden loss triggered protocol. RAF Coastal Command mobilized air-sea rescue units before sunrise. The first out were Supermarine Walrus amphibious aircraft, slow-flying but purpose-built for maritime search. Their departure was followed by consolidated PBY Catalinas from RAF Castle Archdale, aircraft designed for long-distance patrols across hostile water. The search conditions were brutal. Winds reached 45 knots and freezing spray-coated aircraft windscreens within minutes of flight. The North Sea, dark, cold, and vast, offered no help. To fly above it in daylight was unforgiving. To attempt rescue operations in winter was closer to endurance than strategy. Flight Lieutenant Alfred Kane, one of the Catalina pilots assigned to the mission, later wrote in his post-war memoir, "You scan the waves long enough and the ocean begins to play tricks on the eyes. Every crest becomes a wing. Every shadow becomes a raft. Hope is constant, and disappointment comes every few seconds." By midday, one of the Walrus search crews sighted debris roughly 58 miles east of Peterhead. It was not an aircraft fuselage or anything that could confirm a full wreck, but fragments. A partially frozen life vest. A torn section of fabric believed to be part of a Wellington tail assembly. Loose oxygen tubing. Saltwater-swollen paper maps blurred beyond readability. But none of these fragments provided answers. They only reinforced a single chilling fact. Something had happened quickly. The men aboard those aircraft would have known procedures, flare deployment, raft release, radio distress signaling, but there had been none. As the search expanded north and east, a second finding was logged. A dinghy, deflated, empty, adrift. RAF standard procedure required dinghies to be manually released or triggered by impact. The recovered raft showed no sign of full deployment. This raised a troubling possibility. Either there was no time for the crews to deploy survival equipment, or they never had the chance. Investigators at the time began exploring familiar causes. Mechanical failure was one. Icing had been reported across multiple RAF missions that month. Layers of ice could cripple aerofoils, jam control surfaces, or choke carburetor intakes. Yet for 5 aircraft to suffer the same fate nearly simultaneously remained statistically improbable. The second theory was navigational drift. In storms, compasses could become unreliable. Crews might unknowingly turn toward occupied Norway, placing them within range of German night fighters. But German Luftwaffe night fighter records from Stavanger, Aalborg, and Lista contain no claims for that night. Not even unconfirmed sightings. That absence was deeply troubling. A third theory was enemy anti-aircraft fire from naval convoys. The RAF suspected German resupply ships operating near the Norwegian coastline. But again, intelligence intercepts, decrypted by British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, yielded no mention of intercepted bombers or defensive engagements. One line from the official British after-action report reads, "No enemy communications intercepted matching the loss of 5 bomber-class aircraft. No intelligence correlation found." For families back home, silence continued. Telegrams were prepared but not yet sent. Hope had not been declared lost, but absence had become louder than certainty. At RAF Lossiemouth, pilots scheduled for future missions avoided speaking of the disappearance openly. One air gunner recalled decades later, "No one said the word cursed, but everyone thought it." Crews studied map boards, checked instruments compulsively, and watched the sea with a new, uneasy awareness. Even senior officers struggled to explain the incident. Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Pearce was quoted privately saying, "1 bomber vanishing is unfortunate. 2 is exceptional. 5 demands an answer." But answers were not coming. As daylight faded and the first full day of searching ended, only one conclusion remained clear. The disappearance was not random, not routine, and not easily explained. Whatever had happened out there had occurred fast, silently, and with an efficiency no one expected. And for the RAF, the mystery had only begun to deepen. Morning on February 18th arrived without celebration, without clarity, and without hope of an easy explanation. The rescue effort expanded into one of the largest coordinated searches undertaken by RAF Coastal Command that winter. What had begun as routine retrieval had shifted into a full-scale investigation, one driven not only by urgency, but by the unsettling realization that the loss of 5 aircraft was not aligning with any known wartime pattern. Royal Navy destroyers, HMS Vivacious, HMS Eclipse, and HMS Sherwood, were deployed from Scapa Flow to join the search grid. Their crews knew the sea better than any map could illustrate. They understood its temperament and its capacity to consume everything without evidence. As they moved through rough waters, spotters scanned the horizon, hopeful for signs of life but increasingly aware of the ocean's silence. By late afternoon, HMS Sherwood reported an object sighted off the starboard bow. A small wooden section, likely part of a bomber's interior framework, floated partially submerged. When retrieved, the wood was splintered, not burned, suggesting structural failure rather than explosive damage. This single observation fueled new and unsettling theories. Back at RAF Lossiemouth, the atmosphere was tense but methodical. Intelligence officers, flight engineers, and technical specialists studied chalkboards filled with data. Altitudes, fuel burn rates, projected flight paths, storm mapping overlays, Luftwaffe patrol schedules. Yet each attempt to connect these variables led to contradictions. The lack of distress calls remained central to the mystery. RAF radio protocols were rehearsed repeatedly during training. The crews knew that even moments before impact or under attack, a short transmission, even a single incomplete word, was expected. But nothing had been received. One investigator speculated that lightning or sudden atmospheric electrical discharge may have damaged communications. Another proposed carbon monoxide poisoning, noting that pre-1942 oxygen systems occasionally leaked in extreme cold. Yet these explanations could not justify the simultaneous loss of multiple aircraft. On the second day of the search, another anomaly emerged. A Catalina search aircraft spotted markings in the waves, what looked like an oil slick stretching across the water's surface. Samples were collected. The thick, black residue suggested aviation fuel mixed with engine lubricant from a Rolls-Royce Merlin or Bristol Pegasus engine, both used in RAF bombers. But the slick extended unusually far, covering nearly 3 kilometers of open sea. This raised a concerning hypothesis. Multiple aircraft may have impacted within a narrow time frame and concentrated radius, almost as if they had descended simultaneously. The question shifted from what had happened to why it had happened at once. A confidential internal report drafted for Air Vice Marshal John Slessor included a terse line. Pattern indicates coordinated loss event, cause unknown. The phrase remained controversial. Coordination implied action, not accident. Meanwhile, attention turned briefly to German involvement. Intelligence officers reviewed Luftwaffe night fighter logs, Kriegsmarine convoy activity, and decrypted Enigma intercepts from signals intelligence at Bletchley Park. Nothing referenced the disappearance. No enemy unit claimed success. No coded transmission hinted at an interception or engagement. One German record, a weather patrol aircraft log from Stavanger, noted unusual cloud formations and abrupt barometric drops over the North Sea during the same time window. These atmospheric shifts were later identified as a potential meteorological phenomenon, rapid freezing turbulence capable of disorienting instruments and compromising lift. But whether such conditions could down 5 bombers in near unison remained uncertain. Families eventually received telegrams, carefully worded, emotionally restrained. Missing. Presumed lost during operations. Many refused to accept the finality. Wives left lamps burning through the night. Parents listened for newspaper updates and waited for letters that would never arrive. Some crew members' personal belongings, logbooks, photographs, handmade good luck tokens, remained neatly stored on air station shelves for months. As days passed, the search effort was gradually reduced. Winter storms closed in and the North Sea reclaimed its surface, calm at times, hostile at others. The wreckage recovered was catalogued and stored, though none of it offered decisive answers. In official records, the disappearance became a line entry and a case file. In the minds of those who had served alongside the missing men, it became something heavier, a silent gap in the war's timeline. What disturbed many most was not the absence itself, but the precision of that absence. 5 aircraft, 5 crews, 1 night, no witnesses, no answers. And the North Sea, deep, cold, and indifferent, remained the final keeper of whatever happened there. The investigation would continue, but so would the uncertainty. Because every clue collected only formed a darker question, one that no one yet dared speak aloud. Was the disappearance a tragic coincidence, or the result of something far more deliberate? As winter deepened across Britain, the disappearance of the 5 RAF bombers shifted from an operational concern to an unresolved mystery, one that demanded formal inquiry. On February 22, 1942, a joint investigative panel was assembled, consisting of RAF flight engineers, navigational specialists, meteorologists, and intelligence officers. Their task appeared straightforward: determine what caused the simultaneous loss of 5 aircraft. Yet from the beginning the evidence resisted simplicity. Inside a dimly lit briefing room at RAF Lossiemouth, chalkboards lined the walls, covered in diagrams of flight paths, fuel estimates, and weather projections. The aircraft involved, 2 Vickers Wellingtons and 3 Handley Page Hamptons, were mechanically inspected weeks prior to the mission. Maintenance logs revealed no recurring faults severe enough to ground them. Engines were rated operational. Radios functional. Airframes within acceptable limits. The mission itself was routine compared to others flown that month. But the pattern of disappearance, sudden, silent, and complete, challenged every conventional explanation. One line of inquiry focused on weather. The storm system active that night was among the most severe recorded that February. Meteorologist Captain Herbert Lowell presented barometric maps showing rapid drops in pressure over the North Sea, drops sharp enough to disrupt airflow, freeze instruments, and create what modern pilots describe as ice microbursts. In low visibility, encountering such a hazard could send an aircraft into an unrecoverable descent. Yet this theory faltered under scrutiny. Experienced air crews were trained to recognize icing and turbulence. Emergency descent procedures, radio prioritization, and flare deployment should have followed. Instead, there was nothing. A second theory examined navigational error. Radio beam navigation, still experimental at the time, could become unreliable during electrical storms. If the aircraft drifted off course, they may have entered Luftwaffe-controlled airspace along the Norwegian coastline. German reconnaissance patrols and searchlights guarded the fjords, supported by night fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 110G, a deadly interceptor. But once again records contradicted suspicion. Luftwaffe night fighter reports from Stavanger, Aalborg, and Værnes contain no claims, no sightings, no radar detections, nothing resembling 5 British bombers. Then a third, more unsettling theory emerged: the possibility of coordinated enemy interception at sea. Throughout early 1942, the Kriegsmarine operated flak-equipped resupply ships and weather vessels across the northern maritime zone. Some carried radar installations, capable of detecting approaching aircraft. If the bombers crossed paths with one such convoy, they may have been met with concentrated anti-aircraft fire. But this explanation also fractured under evidence. Kriegsmarine logs later examined via intelligence channels contain no matching engagements. No anti-aircraft reports. No wreckage sightings. One entry, however brief and cryptic, stood out. Unusual aerial traffic detected west of Stavanger. Duration short. No visual confirmation. It offered no conclusion, only more questions. With mechanical failure, weather, navigation drift, and enemy fire all examined yet inconclusive, the panel shifted toward multi-causal explanations. Perhaps icing combined with disorientation or engine strain compounded by electrical interference. Still, the timing remained the problem. 4-5 aircraft to succumb independently yet nearly simultaneously required more than coincidence. In his final report draft, Wing Commander Douglas Rathmore wrote, "Isolation is a danger, but simultaneity is a phenomenon." The phrasing sparked debate among those reviewing the document. For some, it implied coordination, something human-driven. For others, it hinted at a rare natural event, one powerful enough to affect multiple aircraft at the same time. Yet the inquiry faced another complication: public morale. In early 1942, Britain was still recovering from the Blitz. Propaganda focused on resilience, determination, and strategic progress. Reporting that 5 fully operational bombers had vanished under unknown circumstances risked damaging faith in the war effort. Thus, the official conclusion, shared only internally, was carefully worded: cause unknown. Aircraft and crews presumed lost due to adverse operational conditions. No mention of anomaly. No mention of simultaneity. No suggestion of German involvement. For the families, the final correspondence arrived quietly, a single envelope delivered by hand. Inside, small sentences carried immense weight. We regret to inform you. Missing in action. Service to country honored. For some households, grief crystallized quickly. For others, especially those who believed the men survived, the absence of wreckage left room for impossible hope. And while official investigation closed, privately, officers whispered an uncomfortable truth. The RAF had lost aircraft before, hundreds. But never like this. 5 bombers. 5 crews. One night. No enemy claims. No surviving signals. No confirmed cause. And as winter gave way to spring, the unanswered questions didn't disappear, they deepened. Because if this loss could not be explained, could it also not be prevented? In the months that followed the disappearance, the story of the 5 lost RAF bombers slipped into the background of wartime reality, overshadowed by larger headlines, new operations, and the relentless pace of the global conflict. Yet for those connected to the missing crews, the silence that followed was far louder than the war itself. The North Sea remained calm one day and violent the next, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, as if the aircraft and the men inside them had never existed at all. Officially, the case was considered closed by mid-1942. The files were archived, marked with the familiar wartime phrasing, missing. No further action. But privately, among aircrews, naval officers, and intelligence analysts, the disappearance became something else. A quiet file, discussed only in unrecorded conversations, speculative briefings, or late-night gatherings in officers' mess halls. Years later, fragments of wreckage washed ashore, never enough to identify individual aircraft, but enough to remind observers that the North Sea held onto its secrets. In 1946, 2 fishermen working off the coast of Grimsby hauled up what appeared to be a propeller blade tangled in their net. The corrosion was extensive, but faint stenciling remained. RR Merlin XX, the exact engine type installed in Wellington bombers lost that night. Further south, in 1953, after a violent storm struck the English coastline, a lifeboat patrol recovered a rusted aluminum panel with faded RAF serial markings. Experts examined the fragment but could not conclusively link it to any one of the missing aircraft. Saltwater, time, and movement had erased certainty. Then came the most intriguing detail nearly 20 years after the mission. A Statoil survey vessel conducting sonar mapping for offshore platforms detected a series of anomalies resting on the seabed at depths ranging from 30 to 60 meters. The shapes were long, symmetrical, and metallic, roughly consistent with aircraft fuselage dimensions from the early 1940s. But storms, currents, and the shifting seabed made mapping incomplete. The objects remained undisturbed, unconfirmed, and unreachable with technology of the time. A short classified note written in 1964 contained a line that remained uncomfortably open-ended. Multiple contacts. Likely aircraft. Possibly connected to RAF file ref. 2499/B. Beneath it, a handwritten annotation added later. No action recommended. Strategic irrelevance. By then, the world had changed. The war was over, Europe was rebuilding, and aviation had entered the jet age. The men who once navigated by stars and dead reckoning now watched aircraft break the sound barrier. Radar, once experimental, now guided commercial flights every minute of every day. But for historians, divers, and relatives, time did not erase the central question. What truly happened that night? To some investigators, the disappearance represented the convergence of multiple natural hazards: icing, turbulence, navigation failure, and exhaustion. To others, it resembled an unrecorded wartime engagement, perhaps with a German naval escort group operating in radio silence, a possibility never fully ruled out. Yet another group, quiet, analytical, and cautious, believed the answer lay not in what was known, but in what was never documented. Wartime chaos left gaps in intelligence records. Missions overlapped. Technology malfunctioned. Entire events slipped between the cracks of history. One historian stated decades later, "War is not a perfect archive. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden, it's simply lost." Today, the story of the 5 RAF bombers exists in a strange space between confirmed history and unsolved case study. Plaques honor the missing crews at RAF Lossiemouth and in town memorials across Britain. Their names are listed alongside hundreds of others whose final moments remain undocumented. The families who once waited received closure only in the form of remembrance, not explanation. For many, the unanswered nature of the loss became part of its legacy. Documents remain stored,